Aquarium of the Pacific. It's so nice to have you here with us tonight in our audience in this Pacific Visions Theater or online. We do stream these lectures live as well as keep them up on our website recorded if you have you missed one. And so we encourage you to revisit what we've done in this 2025 season. My name is Jenny Dean, and I'm the Aquarium's Vice President of Education and Conservation. It's my pleasure to be your host tonight, but I am not the star. The star is our speaker, but we'll get to her soon. It is the holiday season. I don't dress like this all the time, and it's a good reminder of a season of giving, right? And the Aquarium of the Pacific is a nonprofit, and so this season of giving for us is also an opportunity to thank you and all the other generous donors that support the aquarium's operations. I wanted to make a special announcement and thank you to a set of donors that have been really impactful to the aquarium, and in particular this first Wednesday lecture series. And that's Stephen and Brenda Olson. The Olsons have been recurring sponsors of the first Wednesday lecture series and just renewed their support for 2026. Not just that, but they also have been long time involved with the aquarium, including having Stephen join our board back all the way in 2000. So huge thanks to these longtime supporters. We are incredibly grateful for the support that they give us to bring stories of nature, ecosystems, and the threats that are facing these things to our community with the first Wednesday lecture series. Thank you. Yes, round of applause in order. We have a few other sponsors that contribute substantially to this lecture series, and that includes the Osborn and Roork Charitable Trust and the Courtyard by Marriott Long Beach Hotel. Now, getting to tonight's program. It's our pleasure to dive deeply into the world of the Pacific walrus. We don't have a walrus here at the Aquarium of the Pacific, but maybe you've had an opportunity to see one at another association of zoo and aquarium facility, or perhaps even out in the wild. Our speaker tonight has had experience both with those in the wild and in those AZA institutions. She is a familiar face to maybe some of you because she's also a repeat First Wednesday lecture presenter. She was here last December and told you all about polar bears. Who is she? Dr. Karyn Rode. Dr. Rode is a biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey Alaska Science Center. She works with the Eskimo Walrus Commission, the IUCN Polar Bear Specialist Group, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Polar Bear Recovery Team, as well as the U.S.-Russia Agreement on the Conservation and Management of Polar Bears. She collaborates in her role with a variety of different entities at different levels of jurisdiction, from local, state, and federal and international agencies, academic institutions, and research facilities, all on the arenas of walrus and polar bear. Her research focuses on identifying biological and ecological indicators for monitoring large mammal populations and ecosystem change, and determining mechanisms for the population regulation in response to these environmental changes. She also is very curious about how wildlife intersect with you, humans, and the tourism industry that might surround these mammals that people are so interested in. Much of her work is centered on nutritional and physiological ecology and the effects on wildlife body condition, reproduction, and survival. She has authored over 90 scientific publications, and in case you don't find that impressive, it is very, very impressive. 90 publications is a very deep resume. I have a few more accolades to share about her because it's so worth going into how wonderful this woman is. She's a member of the IUCN Polar Bear Specialist Group, the American Zoological Association's Polar Bear Research Council, and the Science/Tech Working Group of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Polar Bear Recovery Team. She got her training in zoology at Washington State University, as well as a bachelor's in wildlife biology from Colorado State University. I encourage you to welcome her warmly with a nice round of applause and silence your cell phones at the same time so we can enjoy her presentation quietly. Okay.
Well, thank you for such a nice introduction, and thank you so much for the opportunity to come back. I really enjoyed being here last year talking to you about polar bears. You're such a wonderful, curious, and interested audience. So I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk to you about Pacific walrus. So in addition to being a really interesting and iconic species, Pacific walrus are also a really important indicator of Arctic marine ecosystems. So there are 2 to 3 subspecies of walrus. There are Atlantic walrus that occur in Greenland and eastern Canada and Norway. There's a population in the Laptev Sea that may or may not be a separate subspecies from the Pacific walrus, but they're largely geographically distinct. So there's not much mixing between the Laptev Sea and the Pacific populations. And so the population I'm going to talk about is the population that occurs between Alaska, so they come into US waters, and they range over into Russia, and those are the Pacific walrus in that region. So the lives of walrus throughout their range, so for all of these subspecies, are really closely tied to sea ice. And that sea ice they use as a platform to rest between bouts of foraging on the ocean floor. So they also occur in really shallow water regions, and the Arctic Ocean is the most shallow ocean in the world. So it's a unique place that provides the habitat needed for Pacific walrus and walrus in the Atlantic and the Laptev as well. The sea ice minimizes their commute to these important foraging areas. So they have basically a floating resting platform over these benthic feeding areas on the bottom of the ocean floor. So their range is closely tied to very shallow water. So in this map showing Alaska and Russia, the white area is the continental shelf, this shallow water that provides habitat for walrus to dive to the ocean floor. And they have a seasonal distribution. So this time of year in the winter, they are in the blue areas, shown here in the winter time. And then in the summertime, they also can range on coastal haulouts. So these red dots are all coastal haulouts where they'll come on land. And then they'll also rest on sea ice and move into the Chukchi Sea. Males and females have different ranges in the summertime. So in the winter, they're all in the northern Bering Sea. But in the summertime, females and their calves will migrate into the Chukchi Sea, while the males primarily stay in the Bering Sea. So walruses in the wild can live up to about 30 years of age. Females will have their first calf when they're about 6 years old, and that calf will stay with her for about 2 years. She's pregnant for about 14 and a half months, so breeding season is in February, and then the following May, she'll have that calf and then keep that calf with her for 2.5 years. And they can be, on average, females are about 800 to 900 pounds on average. This is a female in the middle of this picture, and that's probably like a 2-year-old calf that's next to her. But males can be twice the size of females, so they can weigh up to 2,000 pounds. And amazingly, these animals are surviving primarily on clams that they suck the meat out of on the ocean floor. Walruses have been estimated to eat 4,000 to 6,000 clams per day, or 5% of their body mass. So it's really impressive that you have such a large animal that's surviving on such a small food item. The sea ice is not only important to provide a resting habitat, but the sea ice also helps maintain the benthic foraging habitat that they need. So sea ice has algae that grows underneath it, and then phytoplankton that blooms in the shallower waters of the Arctic Ocean. They die off, and those nutrients go to the ocean floor and help promote the habitat in the benthic areas that are the important feeding areas for Pacific walrus. And walrus themselves actually also help, like many grazers, they help maintain their own foraging habitat as well. I'm going to show you a video on the next slide that's actually of an Atlantic walrus taken by our colleague Eric Bjorn. And it shows that when they're feeding on the ocean floor, they stir up a lot of sediment, and that sediment helps distribute nutrients that also helps maintain their feeding habitat. And you can see in this video that they don't really use their tusks. They don't use their tusks for feeding. They use their vibrissae. They have very thick vibrissae that help them navigate that ocean floor. And then they use their flippers and their very agile mouth to get into the clams. And then they have a really strong sucking mechanism. So if you ever have the opportunity to go to SeaWorld and do a behind the scenes tour, they have their walruses, you can see how well they suck their food, and that's how walruses feed in the wild. They have a really strong sucking mechanism to pull out the clam meat. So last year when I was here talking about polar bears, I showed this video of flying in the Chukchi Sea in March. And one of the things I described is that, during this time of year, and this is spring, so starting to warm up in the Chukchi Sea, but it does look like a pretty desolate landscape, these Arctic environments. And I think what's so interesting about species like polar bears that I talked about last year, but even more impressive about Pacific walrus, is that this landscape is not as desolate as it looks. So in the summertime, the sea ice starts to retreat, and females and their calves of Pacific walrus will move into the Chukchi Sea and into this habitat. And things look really different. On the coast of Alaska, the northwest coast of Alaska, as sea ice has become even less prominent during the summer months, now Pacific walrus are hauling out in really, really large numbers at a single location off the northwest coast of Alaska. And this is drone imagery taken of this site in Point Lay. And I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that. So these congregations are impressive for a couple of reasons. One, they are a clear indicator of how incredibly productive the Chukchi Sea and that northern Bering Sea and Chukchi Sea habitat is. These are large numbers of really large animals that are getting their food from the benthic, so from the ocean floor. So it's a very unique system. The other reason that these haulouts are pretty impressive is that it really signals a change that has occurred, because walrus have not historically hauled out in these really large numbers on land during this time of year. So typically, females and their calves, when they migrate into the Chukchi Sea in May and June, they will stay with this sea ice. Their calves, when they are first born, can't dive to the ocean floor with them, so females will leave their calves on the sea ice while they're diving. So having that ice platform above their foraging habitats is really important to them. So it is a change that you're seeing now, these really large haulouts that are on land and further from their foraging habitat. So since 2007, sea ice has retreated from nearly all the Chukchi Sea shelf in 15 of 17 years, and that's a new dynamic for this area. So even before there was substantial environmental change that's occurring in the Arctic, federal and state biologists have long been involved in managing wildlife species, and that includes my agency, the U.S. Geological Survey. We have a really long history of helping to provide information to inform management of trust species. So walrus are managed under the Department of Interior, and they're considered a trust species, meaning this is a natural resource for our country, and it's something that there's multiple interests and needs surrounding their management, and so the role we play with my agency is to provide information about those species. Pacific walrus, because they're a marine mammal, are also protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and there's certain specifications for monitoring that's required of those populations, or those species that are marine mammals. Pacific walrus are also an important subsistence and cultural species to Alaska Native people. There are communities in Alaska that are largely subsistence, and some of which rely very heavily on walrus as food for themselves and for their families. And they've been doing this for thousands of years. They also have a strong relationship with walrus culturally, since it's been such a part of their lives for thousands of years. There are people who over generations and generations, has been taught how to carve ivory, and so they do a lot of ivory art from the tusks. So this is a really important resource for Alaska Native people, and we work closely with the Eskimo Walrus Commission. There's also economic activity that occurs in Pacific walrus habitat, so there's a need for information on when and where people are going to encounter walrus. The USGS helps support real-time monitoring of those large coastal haulouts, and that helps guide barges to resupply local villages. We also can inform aircraft operators to avoid disturbance of the haulout. Walruses will stampede, and so knowing when and where people are going to encounter walruses can both help protect them, but also guide economic activity. And as I mentioned in the title is that in addition to these really applied needs, Pacific walrus are a really good indicator species for Arctic marine systems, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And one of the reasons that it's so important that we monitor in terms of an indicator species is that the areas that walrus live are really important economically. So Pacific walrus range into the northern Bering Sea, and many of you are probably very familiar with how important those areas are for the seafood industries. There are species that live in the benthic environment of the Bering Sea, such as crabs, that are particularly sensitive to changes in ocean temperature and changes in sea ice dynamics. So walrus can be a really important indicator of those systems that can be difficult to monitor. So monitoring the benthic environment is obviously a difficult task, and so walrus kind of bring that to the surface and knowing kind of how the benthos is faring. So I work with the U.S. Geological Survey, and these are my colleagues, Tony Fishbach, Dr. Bill Beatty, and Dr. Rebecca Taylor. We work for a science agency, and some years ago, the biological researchers from different agencies like the Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service were pulled out of those agencies and put into the U.S. Geological Survey. And that was done to try to move science away from policy and management and keep those very separate. And so my agency has no management or policy or regulatory authority. We don't make policy or management recommendations. We purely provide information, so unbiased, peer-reviewed, publicly available science to inform decisions about these species. We work with a variety of partners that we both serve and collaborate with. That includes the North Slope Borough. They're kind of like a county that's on the North Slope of Alaska and obviously very involved in wildlife issues. The Eskimo Walrus Commission, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the state of Alaska. But as mentioned in the introduction, we also work closely with facilities that manage walrus under human care. They're a very difficult species to study, and working with zoos and aquarium is really important for our work because it helps us develop new methods and understand more about walrus physiology and do things that we just can't do with them in the wild. So I'll tell you a little bit about some of the work we do. So how do we study this species? I just said it's quite hard to do. And what kind of questions are we trying to address? Well, we want to monitor population trends. How many walrus are there and how are the populations changing? So we do that through, largely now, we do that through ship expeditions, which I'll talk more about. We need to monitor their distribution and movement patterns that are really important for helping people know where they're going to encounter walrus. And monitor use of the coastal haulout, since that's such a big area that's impacted with walrus. The information we can provide aids managers in minimizing disturbance and also helps with navigating ship traffic. And then we work with hunters to monitor reproduction and health. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about some of this work. In June, in some years, but not all, we do ship expeditions in the Chukchi Sea. The USGS partners with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and also with other agencies and entities to do biopsy sampling of walrus, which provides a small tissue sample that we can individually ID walrus with. By doing that year after year, you can determine survival rates. So you find individual walruses that you re-encounter. You can estimate survival rates and reproduction and have a way to estimate population abundance. The USGS has over many years developed tags that can be deployed on walrus to track their movements. So we can't sedate walruses. They're very large and they have a breathing mechanism so that if you use a sedation drug, they'll stop breathing. So we had to come up with alternative methods for tagging them, and this has been largely led by my colleague Tony Fischbach. And so the primary way that we've been able to tag walrus and learn about their movements is to deploy a tag into their blubber by shooting with a bow and arrow. And so that's how the tag gets deployed. It usually lasts, unfortunately, only about 3 months, so we only get a snippet of time. So one of the big challenges we've had with walruses is being able to have year-round movement patterns. So you have to try to tag them at different times of the year to try to figure out their patterns. And so you can see a little bit about what we've been able to learn about their movements. And imagine, this is a species in a really remote area. So without tags, it's almost impossible to know how individuals range. So in this animation, there's a blue line at the top, and that's the continental shelf. So at that point, the water gets really, really deep. So it's not good habitat for Pacific walrus. The white is this sea ice. And I'll restart this animation, but it starts in July, and in July you'll see that the ice starts to retreat northward, and the red dots are the walrus, and as the ice gets far enough towards the continental shelf, the walruses abandon the ice and move to land because it's getting too far away from their feeding habitats. Let me see if I can get it to play again. I'll go back. So it'll start here in July. So the ice is retreating north, it's getting towards that blue line. The walruses are staying with ice, and now they've left. When some of them have moved largely to the haul out on the northwest coast of Alaska, and then some also haul out in Chukotka on the Russian side. And so in the summertime, there now primarily are 2 large haul outs, one on the Chukotkan side of the Chukchi Sea and the one that occurs on the northwest coast of Alaska. So monitoring these haul-outs, one of the tools that we've started to use is drones, and we can get drones that are quite quiet, and we fly them really high so that it doesn't disturb the haul-out or any of the animals there. And it provides a variety of information. We can determine how many animals are using the area, what the sex age. We can try to estimate sex and age of the animals. And then we've also started doing work to try to see if we can compare our drone images to satellite images to see if we can detect the occurrence of the haul out, but also potentially be able to count walruses based on the size of the images that we get from satellite. So Tony Fischbach has been leading an effort to see if we can do more work via satellite that then would not require us to use drones every year. We can do age composition. So this slide is showing that, circling some of the young calves. So we can get information like cow to calf ratios, which are important in assessing reproduction for the population. And more recently, we've been expanding drone-based work to estimate the size and body condition of walrus. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So we collaborate with hunters to monitor walrus reproduction and health. It's a really good opportunity because they are handling walruses. We can measure them. We can get a lot of samples. Samples can provide us information like contaminant exposure that walruses are experiencing, any pathogens that they have or disease. We can look at things like toxic algae blooms that walruses may be exposed to. And obviously hunters are very interested in those things because of the potential to transmit any of those to hunters. So we collect all those types of samples and work with a variety of entities to monitor the health of walrus via hunters. We also have done work investigating ship traffic. There's a lot of conversation about the Arctic being open to more vessel traffic, and so trying to provide some information on how might that change encounter rates that walrus have with ships. So what have we learned? So these are all the kind of topics that we've been working to address. What are some of the things that we've learned? So the map on the left is showing locations of biopsy samples from the ship expeditions that have been done in June. And from the information, from those biopsies, we've been able to estimate the size of the walrus population. So there's been some previous efforts to try to estimate how many walrus there are. And you can imagine that with most marine mammals that are in the water a lot, it's actually really hard to know how many animals there are. There was an attempt at an aerial survey, but they weren't able to. If you do an aerial survey, you have to cover almost all the area that the animals occur, and so that survey wasn't able to do that. So this is one of the first times that an estimate has been able to be made. They collected 9,300 biopsy samples, and their estimate, which has some error, is there's about 257,000 walruses. So I have two explanations on that, and my colleague who I work with asked, why two explanation points? I've also studied polar bears, and I've also studied brown bears and primates, and never do you have 100,000 of anything that I've ever studied before. So that number is huge, and that system in one part of the Arctic, this is just one part of the Arctic, we're just talking about the Pacific walrus population that ranges between Alaska coast and the Russian coast, that there's that many animals of that size, tells you that that system is really, really unique. I mean, there's really nothing comparable at any other latitude that has a benthic system that's that productive to support that kind of population. Of course, there's error, and it's a big range, but notice that the low number is 171,000. So we're talking a lot of biomass of walrus in that system, which is really impressive. Practically, that information is really important for management. Those abundance estimates can help us determine sustainability of harvest. So meaning, is harvest going to change the size of the population? Well, the harvest level is low, so the proportion of animals that are being taken by local hunters is very small. It's less than 2% of the population, so that's well within what is sustainable. We've also, USGS has also done population model to try to understand trend, and so this figure behind me here it's showing the proportion of the population relative to what it was estimated to be in 1981. So it's showing a decline, but that decline needs some context to it. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, many marine mammals were commercially harvested, and so many of them were at kind of the lowest levels that they have been in 100 years. As protections started being put in place, like starting in the 1950s, and then with the Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1972, a lot of marine mammal populations started to grow, including the Pacific walrus population. What happens when any wildlife population grows is that at some point it's going to hit where the habitat can't support more growth. And so what is classic in that situation is that a population will increase. They hit what's called carrying capacity, which is that's the maximum number of animals that the habitat can support, and then it starts to decline, and then it'll stabilize. So this appears to be what happened with the Pacific walrus population. In 1981, there was a decline, but then that decline has kind of started to stabilize over time. So probably the hypothesis of what's happening currently is that it's likely that walrus are kind of at a stable balance with the amount of habitat that's available to them. But of course, a lot is changing in the Arctic at the same time. But we've been able to recreate kind of what the population trend has been in recent years. The population information that we're able to provide has been important in addressing proposals to list Pacific walrus under the Endangered Species Act because of sea ice loss. And so our information has been provided a number of times as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has considered proposals about whether they should be a listed species. At the haul-out, we've been able to estimate, USGS has been able to estimate that there's been as many as 190,000 walruses using the Point Lay, Alaska haul-out, so just the one haul-out on the Alaska coast. What's cool about being able to have estimated how many walrus are all at that haul-out is it provides another completely separate estimate of how many walruses there are. So the estimate based on the ship expeditions, the low end of that was 171,000. Well, this estimate is that there was 190,000 using just the haul out in Point Lay, and we know that there was also walruses at that time. The males were in the Bering Sea, and there was also walruses on the Chukotka coast, and also a very large haul out. So it's more support that these estimates of hundreds of thousands of these animals in this area is likely. And the haul out that is on the northwest coast of Alaska is primarily females and calves. The figure there on the right is just showing 2 years in which the number of walruses using the haul out was estimated and showing their confidence intervals. USGS has also been able to do research to monitor walrus behavior in response to sea ice changes. So this figure here on the right is showing the probability that walrus are doing one of 3 different behaviors. Either they're in the water foraging, they're in the water and not foraging, or they're hauled out. And then this is how they're spending their time depending on what habitat is available to them. So on the left is when there's only ice available, if there's ice and land, or if there's only land. So if there's ice available, they're spending about 60% of their time in the water feeding, and only about 10% of their time in the water not feeding. But when there's only land, they're spending about 40% of their time in the water and not feeding. And that's because they're having to commute from the haul out to their foraging areas. So normally they would be resting on sea ice and dive right above their foraging habitat. But when the sea ice moves off the continental shelf, they're having to be at a land haul out that's further away from their foraging habitat. So more time traveling and not foraging has the potential to affect female condition and calf health, because those are the animals that are hauling out in those big land-based haul outs. So one of the other pieces of work that we've been doing is trying to identify some methods to track female body condition and calf size. And so this is a project that I've been able to work a fair bit on. And so we went first to zoos and aquariums where we could take images of walruses above them and also weigh them. And we developed a relationship, shown right here behind me, between the area of a walrus that allows us to estimate their body mass. So now we can go to images from the haul out, like this, here, and we can find animals that aren't piled on top of each other, because we have to be able to see their whole body. So those are largely on the edge of the herd. And then we can estimate their body mass. So over time, we can get a sample of adult females and also of calves, and we can track from year to year how much variation is there potentially in body mass and size. And this is particularly important because calves, this is in September, so calves are only a few years or a few months old. They're still largely dependent on their mother's milk. The females are having to swim out to foraging habitat and leave the calves potentially longer. So at least gives us another tool to try to track whether there's any impacts on calf survival or reproduction. So the Arctic is a really dynamic and changing environment. So it already was, because there's such seasonality to that habitat. But then you're probably well aware, and I think I showed some of these for those of you who were here last year, some of these figures of how sea ice has changed in this part of the Arctic. So the bottom figure is showing sea ice extent for the months of June to November. And so there was a pretty dramatic decline over a 30-year period, and current sea ice extent is about half of what it used to be. There may be some stabilization, so that's maybe not declining as dramatically as it has to this date. But there's also some pretty significant changes in sea ice during other times of year, like the springtime. And where that's going to kind of settle out is unclear, but we've seen some unprecedented years of low spring sea ice. This all just points to the need for continuous monitoring. So one of the things that federal agencies are capable of doing with these long-term research programs is that we have long-term data. So we have baselines. We're able to get a population estimate now so that later on, if you estimate again, you can determine if there's been a change in the population. That's something that's somewhat unique to these long-term data sets that we're able to maintain, because versus more like short-term studies. So there is a need to continue kind of this monitoring on a more close basis because of a lot of change. So we work a lot with partners in Alaska. I think the really great thing that's happened, at least in my time of working in Alaska, is that there's a lot of partnerships to support wildlife, both studying wildlife and getting the information to help inform management and policy. That includes with industry, with Native people and local communities, between different agencies, with state governments and local governments. And so we really work together collectively to try to collect information. Monitoring how wildlife responds to environmental change is something that, that my agencies, particularly our biologists, are trained to do. This is what we do. So we are really, a lot of the work that we do and the methods that we develop get used in other parts of the world. So we're able to generate new tools and innovative approaches that are really helping us better understand not only Pacific walrus, but also other species. So with that, I want to thank you so much for being here, and I hope that you learned something new about walrus. And if this works, I'm happy to take some questions. Because this is being recorded, we have some people in the audience that can give you a microphone so that you can speak your question into the microphone and the people that are watching online can hear you.
Hi, you said that the walruses are not using their tusks for foraging and to help with the eating. What do they use those dynamic tusks for?
Yeah, great question. So it helps them haul out on the ice. And then also you'll see some like sparring between males with the tusk as well. You can imagine it's quite slippery to get out on the ice. You know, they're wet, and so those tusks are really helpful for them to pull themselves back up onto the ice.
What was the count? Now I have to remember what I was going to say. What was the count again on how many clams they eat per day?
Like 4,000 to 6,000.
Okay, and do the Atlantic species also feed off clams?
They do. They're a little bit smaller body size.
That's a lot of clams. I mean, who's counting the clams?
Well, and I understand they're quite expensive animals to keep in human care, as you can imagine, because of the large amount of somewhat luxurious food that they eat. Yeah, you can imagine the clam beds. I mean, you know, when I was talking about this species as an indicator, you know, I mean, that's, you know, you can't see those clam beds. You know, I mean, how do you monitor the health of those clam beds? I mean, walrus are pretty much doing that for you. So you can see something on the surface that's telling you something that's happening at the bottom of the ocean. Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to.
So you mentioned that in the summer, the male and the female populations split. Is there a reason why they like split up so dramatically?
Yeah, I don't know if there is like a known answer to that. I can only speak to that there's a lot of mammals that will sexually segregate like that, and it's usually when females have their young, and it can be just a more protected environment. You know, the males are big, and when they are hauling out, I don't know if there's some protectiveness. I mean, calves do get crushed. Even at these big haul-outs, they get crushed. I mean, you see them trying to like swim to the surface of the herd, you know, because they're just mass animals. So I don't know if it's just sort of selected over time for that, because those young calves need a more protective environment. And it's something that's interesting about these changes in these haul-outs, because when they haul on the sea ice, they're in small groups of animals, you know, not these like 100,000 in one place. So, yeah.
Those are quite large animals. Do they have any natural predators?
Good question. I was talking to someone else about that. Polar bears, we're learning, they probably don't have quite as much defense against them as I thought they did. So I've been trying to a long time understand the role of Pacific walrus and polar bear diets, because polar bears in the Chukchi Sea are doing quite well, and they're some of the largest in the world, and I've wondered how much walrus play a role in that. In their ship expeditions that they did last year, they saw quite a few polar bears, some of which were preying on calves in particular, and they were able to pluck them off easier than I would have expected. So they're currently putting together some of those data, but at least polar bears for sure. Beyond that, I don't know about other, I'm not sure if there's other predators. I know orcas are kind of coming into the Arctic more and getting a lot of other species, so I don't know if, including polar bears, have been documented. So I would imagine there's probably some cases of that as well.
Hi. Thanks for your talk. You briefly mentioned parasites, disease, and toxic algae. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those dynamics.
Yeah, so contaminant levels, fortunately, I can kind of go one by one. So contaminant levels have been, fortunately, decreasing a fair bit in the Chukchi Sea. So it varies, you may know that it varies regionally because of circulation patterns, and so partly because of luck, but then also some of them obviously have been more regulated, and so they've declined. So contaminant levels haven't been noted to be particularly high. There's a lot of different contaminants though, so I know some have probably increased, but it hasn't been something that's been raised as one of the more urgent issues. There's a kind of increasing surveillance for pathogens. Avian flu, I think, is definitely something on everyone's radar because it's already affected marine mammal species and been documented even in that part of the world. So there is surveillance for that that's just really started. But other pathogens, nothing that I'm aware of that has had any kind of substantial effect on the walruses or that is concerning for humans. So what has been a bit more concerning is some of the algal blooms and some of the toxins that get into the clams, and then the walruses have that either in their bellies, and so there's ongoing work looking at a variety of walrus tissues to track those, and also particularly the clams that are in the walrus's stomach, which are also eaten by native people, so that can be concerning, so there's continuous monitoring for that as well.
I was wondering, the biopsies you take, are those of both male and female walruses, and do you opportunistically take them from people's hunts of the walruses?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the expeditions occurred in June in the Chukchi Sea, and so primarily the animals that are in the Chukchi Sea were females and calves. So the way that population estimate was done for Pacific walrus was that they assumed a sex ratio of 1-to-1 male-female walruses, which has been shown through other research. So they weren't actually biopsying males. The question of whether they used biopsy from the hunt, I'm not sure about that. I can't recall whether they did or not. I think they didn't because, actually I'm pretty sure they didn't because the harvest is at a different time and they needed it to be taken in kind of one time period only. But I'm not totally sure about if they were using any of the harvested samples.
Well, I think it kind of just overlaps. I was just going to ask because you keep referring to tissue samples. And that was, how do you get those tissue samples?
Oh, could you repeat your question? Sorry.
How do you get the tissue samples that you've talked about?
Oh, the biopsy?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they can retrieve, so the biopsy will be in a little dart, and so they're able to retrieve that, and then it has just it's a very small tissue sample that's in that dart, but it's enough to get the genetic information they need to individually ID. I'm not exactly sure how. I did not go out on the expeditions, and so I've seen some video, but I actually don't know exactly how they were going about getting back. I know with polar bears, we also biopsy dart, and sometimes we have a floater on it, or we have, and we definitely have it colored in some way so that you can see it on the ice and you're able to go in and get it.
Thank you for your talk. My question relates back to those 4,000 clams. You said that if the habitat will not sustain the population of the walruses, that the population would decline. My question is, does it decline because of a die-off, or is it that the females actually withhold birth?
Yes, that's a really good question. I think, the primary we don't know the answer to that for sure. Well, I take that back. We didn't have great data, but there was some body mass and calf size data from the time periods of when the population was higher and when it was declining. And there's some indications there that female size was smaller, which the primary mechanism wouldn't necessarily be that she might not have a calf, because reproduction in mammals, it kind of depends. Walruses are different, but reproduction itself, like actually having the young, sometimes is less costly than lactation. So often what can happen first is that there's poor calf growth and poor calf survival. Often that's sort of like the first step in many mammals as to how, when there's nutritional issues, so like less food resources, the first thing that happens is the female isn't able to lactate or have as much quality milk. And we've actually been working with hunters to collect milk from harvested females, and I've been looking at calf size relative to milk quality to kind of start to try to get at this answer, like what is the mechanism? If a female's in poor condition, how is that likely to affect what stages of reproduction? Will she still have a calf, or will she have a calf and then she won't produce this high quality milk, the calf won't grow as well, will have a lower chance of survival? So we don't really know, but most likely nutritional effects first affect the survival of young before they affect whether or not she has a calf. But there may be some, we also are trying to collect like reproductive tracts where we can try to look at whether or not females had a calf every year, what was her condition when she had one, to try to piece together some of them. So a lot of unknowns, I guess, but generally I think it's not adult survival. Adult survival in mammals is really robust, so the first thing to go is usually some aspect of reproduction and survival of young. Yeah, 2 more questions. Yes.
Hi there. You mentioned that the walruses have to travel farther to obtain food due to the receding ice. And I'm curious to know if any work is being done to create artificial haul-out areas that mimic the sea ice maybe, so that they don't have to work as hard for their food.
I haven't heard that as much with walrus, but I've definitely heard a lot of talk about that for polar bears. Primarily because polar bears also use it as a feeding platform. Like polar bears can't access their food without the sea ice, whereas walruses will come to land and then swim out to their foraging areas. So I haven't heard any really serious conversation about trying to do that, but I've definitely heard that brought up in a number of situations about like, is there a way to make some artificial platforms that could be used by a variety of species?
Thank you for coming this evening. I was curious about criteria for hunting. Are there restrictions on moms with calves, et cetera? I think 30 years ago, from my understanding, there used to be a lot of orphan calves from hunting practices.
Yeah, so there are not restrictions on getting females with calves. The harvest is definitely well within a sustainable range, and since this is an important part of their subsistence and cultural resource, that isn't. I'm not part of the agency that works with the Eskimo Walrus Commission on working to manage the harvest, but there aren't limitations on that. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
know that there are a ton more questions, but you have an opportunity to ask those questions one-to-one with Dr. Rode in the reception that follows this event. So I encourage you to have a conversation with her, as well as those that are around you. So what happens next is cocktails, crafts, and conversation. There is a no-host bar and an opportunity to make a holiday token to take home with you. We want you to come back. January 7th will be our first 2026 lecture and features whales. The gray whale that is found off here California's coast. So we encourage you to come back and hear about that wonderful mammal from biologist Holly Luhi. And if you like what you heard tonight, or you like the programming more broadly of the Aquarium of the Pacific, we encourage you to donate to us. We have a donation option, $5, $20 available in our lobby for this holiday season. We encourage you to tip-tap to support our programs. Thank you so, so much for coming this evening, and all of you that are online or the future online viewers. Have a wonderful evening and a Happy New Year. We'll see you soon.
Oh.